Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now. I know some people will still be trickling in, but I'm so pleased that you're going to join us this morning. This is actually our 30th webcast, so we're quite excited about that. I'm Dr. Laurie Stevens. I'm the Senior Director of Autism and Clinical Programs at the Help Group, and I'm going to be moderating today's webcast, which is titled Exploring Appreciative Inquiry to Strengthen Parent-Teen Relationships. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. I am a developmental clinical psychologist, and I've been working therapeutically with autistic individuals for over 30 years. And I utilize a strength-based affirming model in all of my work with clients and also in all of the support work that I do in training staff, training parents, working with my clients, and working with families. So a little bit about the Help Group, in case you don't know who we are. The Help Group believes that every young person deserves a great future, and a future where the world finds strength in differences. So we believe that dignity, hope, and opportunity and love are the birthrights of all. And so the Help Group strives to transform lives by recognizing, cultivating, and celebrating the individual gifts of young people with special needs related to autism, learning disabilities, ADHD, developmental delays, and emotional or behavioral challenges, through our family of innovative educational, therapeutic, residential, and vocational programs. And also, we view ourselves as at the cutting edge of research, professional training, outreach, and public policy advocacy, particularly within the realm of special education. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. During the presentation, you can use the chat function in order to ask questions that you might like Dr. Horan to answer or address at the end of this talk. We always do our best to reserve time at the end to be able to address questions, but please understand that oftentimes there's a lot of questions, and we know from doing several of these that we might not get to all of the questions, but we will do our best to answer the questions, as many of the questions as we can. So, today, our webcast topic is Exploring Appreciative Inquiry to Strengthen Parent-Teen Relationships. And I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Shayne Horan. Dr. Horan has a doctorate in education, and he's currently the Vice President of Schools at the Help Group. And he brings to us over 2 decades of transformative leadership, excelling at opening campuses and surpassing enrollment targets and achieving ambitious goals through strategic planning. He's a visionary and a thought leader. Shayne's collaborative and thoughtful approach continues to drive sustained success, with a proven track record in educational growth, top performance accolades, and holding advanced degrees in leadership and educational administration. Dr. Horan inspires positive change and empowers individuals toward a greater case. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Horan, and I hope you enjoy his presentation. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome. Appreciate the introduction, Laurie, and I'm excited to be here to share a little bit of my knowledge and background in the area of both appreciative inquiry and working with teenagers. And so I'm excited to be here. Thank you for joining us this morning for this webcast. My background, as Laurie had said, is in education. So I've spent the last 24, almost 25 years working with students from ages 3 all the way through 18, as well as in a leadership role working with adults. And so my background is in the world of education, and I'm really excited to bring 2 of my favorite things to discuss with you today. One, which is appreciative inquiry, and you'll learn more about that here in a minute. That's something that I had created and developed during my dissertation, and spent a lot of work researching that while I was getting my doctorate. And I was able to apply many of the principles and concepts from appreciative inquiry into my practice, both in my personal life and in my work with teachers, with teenagers, with strategic planning, and with organizations. So I'm excited to bring that to you today, and I'm going to give some insight on how you can use this method and this process with your teenagers and in your parent-teen relationships through a lens of appreciative inquiry. So if you want to go to the next slide. So just a quick overview of what we'll cover. A lot of topics here, a lot of information. I could speak on this for days, But in the interest of time and your time and making sure we have a chance to get through this and give you some tangible things to leave with, I'm going to give you a quick overview. I'll do a brief introduction into what appreciative inquiry is. I will also talk about the 5 principles of appreciative inquiry. And then we're going to look at how those principles interact within the foundation of family dynamics, including how those enter within your teen and parent relationships. And we'll also talk a little bit about some basic assumptions and looking at some things that are happening within the household that will help establish those principles as well. And we'll look at a 3D model of appreciating, imagining, and acting, which is a 3-step process of utilizing some of these strategies when situations arise of conflict, possibly with your teenagers. And finding a heart at peace, also creating a foundation for relationships within your household, within your family dynamics, and with your teenager, giving you strategies to shift to a heart at peace. And then I'm going to do a nice video of some similarities to love and logic. This is some of the principles here also fit well with love and logic. And if you're familiar with love and logic, I suggest, if you're not familiar, I suggest you look at that as a resource. But if you are, you'll see some of those principles within this model as well. And then we're going to look at the relationship foundation pyramid and how you can establish those relationships so that when you do reach those moments of conflict with your teenager, you'll have strategies to improve those relationships. And then we'll end with a question and answer. So I'm looking forward to this. And if you go to the next slide, we'll get started. So first question. What is appreciative inquiry? I'll start by saying, if you look at the center of this box here, appreciative inquiry, it emerged from David Cooperrider's work in the 1980s around organizational behavior. His research led to a positive approach to solving problems. And it was rooted in systems theories such as positive psychology and social constructionism. And he was researching on how to do a problem-based solution through his dissertation, and when he realized the questions that he was asking all related to problems, he found out that created more problems, and the problems perpetuated and those continued. So he created a system to resolve problems coming from a positive core. And so when you look at this chart in the center, it starts with a co-evolutionary process for positive change. And so if you look at the word co, it's created together, meaning with your family, with others, with an organization, with 2 people, or within yourself. And it's to create positive change. And it starts with appreciating the best of what is, then looks a little bit at co-creating and imagining a desired future. And so an opportunity for appreciating the best in yourself, others, and situations. It's a method for co-creating and imagining images of an inspiring and desired future. So what is it that you would like that relationship to look like? It also is a path towards designing a plan of action that can lead to that desired future so that that relationship can sustain itself, that it can be realized, it can be utilized again and again, and it can be achieved. And so this process, not only does it appreciate the best, it creates an image of the desired future or relationship that you'd like, designs a plan of action. It can also be a process that can be utilized over and over again. This is applied in many, many areas, not just in your relationships with your teens, but in your relationships with others, with your peers, in your organizations, with in education. There's now appreciative coaching, there's appreciative living, there's appreciative therapy, and many more uses that this appreciative inquiry process has been utilized. But today we're going to focus on primarily how it strengthens the parent-teen relationship. So go ahead and click to the next slide for me. So here are the first 5 principles. Number 1, think of this as the constructionist principle. Words create worlds. And so when I think about words creating worlds, I think of our conversations with our partners, with our teens, with our friends, and others. They create a broad social agreement through those conversations and communications. So the constructionist principle just really simply says our conversations and our words are going to create the worlds and the reality that exists within our family, within our relationships with our teens, and within others. The second principle is the principle of simultaneity. And this is really the moment we begin asking questions, the moment we begin to speak, change occurs. So the inquiry into something or the questions that we ask, that's the intervention. A question for you to consider right now: what effects are the questions that you're asking having on your teen and the relationship you have with them? We're going to get into this more about what types of questions and how to ask questions and how those questions can improve or enhance that relationship. The next principle is the anticipatory principle. So this is based on research related to the expectation effect, the placebo effect, self-fulfilling prophecy, as well as positive psychology. And so basically this principle states what we anticipate is what we create. The more positive our images of the future or what we would like to happen, the more positive our actions will be today, tomorrow, and in the future. In essence, we are likely to get more of what we anticipate. So another question for you to consider as we're going through this presentation: what outcome are you anticipating the next time your teenager decides to ignore one of your requests to get off their phone or video game or anything that might challenge you in a way that you've asked them to do something or something that you've expected them to do? The next principle is the poetic principle. The poetic principle is simply just the stories and the questions and the language that we focus on, the words that we pay attention to, they inspire the stories that will emerge. So we get what we focus on, and it makes sense to study or focus on successes rather than the failures. All of us sometimes have had problems in our relationships, or we've had our teens challenge us, or we've gotten into arguments. Focusing on the negatives or those arguments or the stories that are getting frustrating for us, those will create more stories like that. When we focus on the successful stories and the things that are working rather than the failures, we can change that narrative. So it makes sense to focus more on what is working rather than what isn't working. If you're continuing to have those arguments and disagreements and challenges, shifting that thinking into finding ways to change that narrative will help you change it. This also relates to the self-fulfilling prophecy, or what psychologists refer to as confirmation bias. And so what we tend to, the stories we tell ourselves tend to become the stories that are our realities as well. Question for you to ponder as we go through this presentation and get more into it: what stories are you telling yourself about your relationship with your teens? What about your relationship with your peers? Your family, with the dynamics that you're in. Some days are different than others, but the stories we choose to focus on, they make a significant difference. And lastly, this is the core of the entire appreciative inquiry process and this core principle. All of these principles stem around positivity and thinking about how that positivity is going to generate more positivity. So it's at the core of appreciative inquiry. Positive emotions will lead to positive results. And in those times when they're difficult, and I call it sometimes emotional hijacking as a term that I have for it, when I'm emotionally hijacked by my teenager and I get into that space of negative, it's really hard to get out of it. So focusing on those positive emotions can lead to positive results. And also thinking about the most positive questions that we're asking, the more positive the outcomes we will have. So think about how you might be looking at your teen and the situations through a positive lens is really important when you're considering these principles and strengthening that relationship with your teen. So let's look at how these play out within the family dynamic. Go ahead and switch to the next slide. So in this slide, you can see a funnel of the 5 principles, and of course you can see a funnel and how these funnel through into what creates the family dynamics within your household So let's look at these just through the funnel for a moment. Think about how these show up in your family right now. How do these 5 principles feed to what creates the family dynamics that's happening in your household with your teenager, with their siblings, with your spouse, with your significant other, with anybody that's in your family unit? How do these principles funnel through to create your current family dynamic? A little bit more specifically, I'll ask some questions to consider. What words and conversations are you using to create your family dynamic? That's the constructionist principle. What stories? That's the poetic principle. What stories are you focusing on? Oftentimes when we get into those negative spaces and our teenagers getting up every day, I don't want to go to school, or I don't want to get out, or I don't want to do this, or I want to play my video games. Are we focusing on those stories and creating those and helping perpetuate those? Another thought to consider is the positive principle. Are you able to remain positive even in those moments when your teenager pushes your last button? I've had my buttons pushed before. I know they'll be pushed again. How do you remain positive in those situations? Because those situations will impact how the family dynamic ends up. And when all of those are being pushed through the funnel, that creates what's underneath the underlying family dynamics. So I want you to consider that as we go through this presentation. How do these 5 principles work within your current family dynamic? And we're going to give you some strategies on how to maybe help change some of those and to keep some of those that are working. Maybe there are some of these that you can recognize right away that are currently working, and that you're really creating a positive family dynamic for you and for your teenager. We'll look at these in a minute later. Let's go to the next slide. So before we go into the principles and a little bit more about you and your teenager, I want to start with these basic assumptions. And I know before we think about how these principles work, it's important for you to consider that you've established some rules, expectations, and responsibilities together. As our teenagers or our youth turn into teenagers, that dynamic changes. And so what rules and expectations are you establishing, and what are the natural and logical consequences when those expectations or rules aren't followed? And have they been created together? So determine those natural and logical consequences together. It's also coming from a place of the basic assumption that clarify these agreements together. Don't assume that your teenager knows your expectations or your rules. Sometimes those need to be taught. Don't assume that your teenager, that you know where your teenager's coming from. We're going to talk about that in a minute, the difference between some of the goals we have as parents versus the goals that our teenagers may have. And then put them in writing. For some families, whenever you put some of these in writing, some of your norms and some of the main things that are important to you and to your teenager, it's much easier to handle those situations when they arise, because they've been created, they're in writing, they're an agreement that you've collaborated together with, and something that you've worked to strategize with each other. And I'm very mindful, and I like to say this whenever I'm presenting these topics, every family has their own set of rules, expectations, and responsibilities. I can recall me being a teenager when I was told that my hair needed to be short. I wanted to grow it. I wanted it to be longer. I come from that age in my family. That was just a rule and expectation. And I was told when I was 18, if I wanted longer hair, that was my choice. But while I was underneath my roof, that was the rule that they imposed on me. Some families, that's not important. So every family has their own set of rules, their expectations, responsibilities. Those are rules that I knew, that I understand, that were created, that we created together. And so understand that the family dynamics will be different for every household and for every child and for every family. And so I'm not here to tell you which rules or expectations or responsibilities your family should have. That's what you have to work on together, and your values will create those. But take careful note of the word together in all of those sentences. When you're doing this together and both you, your family, your teenager, and yourself are on the same page, it's much easier for you to get the outcome that you desire. And as teenagers grow and become more independent, they will push back if they haven't already and are doing so now. They'll push back on those rules that you're imposed. They're going to push back on those rules. And if you have a place to come back and a set of assumptions that you've agreed on, it's much easier to enforce them and to get the outcomes that you hope for from your teenager. And so as we move on to the next slide, consider these assumptions as we look at when we want a goal for our teenagers of behavior. So let's begin to see how these principles play out with appreciative inquiry and can be applied to strengthening your relationships with your teenagers. Let's assume for just a second that we all have a goal of our teen to make the right decision, or just to demonstrate a correct behavior or action. If you're like me, the correct action doesn't always just happen the way we would like it to. So if you look at the top of this pyramid, this is a correct action, and that's a goal for our student. We always want our students to do the right things. We want our child to do the right things. We want our teenagers to do the right things. It doesn't just happen because we want it to, and we don't get to the top of that pyramid without a strong foundation. So our teenagers will challenge us, and they will not always make the right decisions. So in order to do that, we have to create a foundation, and we have to think about some of these principles. Go ahead and switch to the next slide. So as I mentioned, this is the reason that there are grounds for conflict. Number one, the parents have, these are a list of some examples of, we have parent goals and we have teen goals. Here's why we don't get to that correct action right away, especially as our youth become teenagers and as they grow into those teenage years. As parents, we have goals for our teens. Some of those goals might be keep them safe, support their learning and growth, prepare them for their independence. We might be teaching them respect. We want to instill values so that they make those right decisions, or that they can take the correct action or make the right action when faced with a difficult choice or decision that they have. Also, as parents, we love our children, we love our students, we love our family, and we also know that we need to instill discipline and have some rules so that they can make better choices. Those are our set of goals. Now let's look at our teenagers for a moment. Our teens have their own set of goals, and as many of you know, the older that they've become, our students used to sometimes our children would follow different characteristics of things that we wanted them to do. But our teens are starting to get their own set of goals, and they're going to start evolving. One, they're going to explore, and they're going to start to push limits. They're working on experimenting with adulthood. They're trying to find out what it is they like, what it is they want to do. They're going to start exploring. They're going to push the limits for themselves and the limits that you have set upon them or that you've set together. They're experimenting with adulthood, as I'd said, and they're going to start separating from us. They're going to want to be on their own. They're going to want to be in their room. They're going to want to hang out with their friends. They're starting to separate from their parents at that age, and the older they get, the more they do that. They're in a state of self-discovery. They want to figure out who they are. They're sorting out their own beliefs based on the values and beliefs that you've instilled upon them. They're figuring out their gifts. They're figuring out what they're good at. They're figuring out their own talents, and they're exploring their own interests. And often those interests and their gifts and beliefs may become a little different from what some of yours were or what you instilled upon them. And ultimately, they want independence and they want self-direction. And so as you can see, when you have these two differing goals, that's grounds for conflict. That's the moment when our goals may not align perfectly, and so we've set up some grounds for conflict. And this is how we can utilize these 5 principles when those conflicts occur between our teenagers and us and we as parents. And so go ahead and move to the next slide. I'm going to provide a quick example of something that's I may have done in the past. And as I said, this is a process of learning this strategy of using appreciative inquiry and these principles. So looking at grounds for conflict and that funnel again with the principles, here's an example of a goal of a correct action that I've done, and maybe some of you on this webcast have probably done in the past, or maybe you haven't. I desire a correct action from my teenager, and sometimes it's I want them to do this. So maybe I want them to clean the room. I want them to get off the video game. I want them to take out the trash. I want them just to finish the dishes. I want them to just get up and get out of their room for a few minutes. These are sometimes the correct actions that I expect or I desire from my teen. If I look at this from the constructionist in a directive place, if I'm telling my child, I need you to take out the trash, I need you to clean your room, I need you to get off the video game, if that's the words and the language that I'm creating, from a directive standpoint, I'm beginning to construct a story that I'm always telling my teenager to do this or do that. Similarly, my teenager is expecting me to tell them to do this and to tell them to do that. Clean your room, get off the video game. I told you to stop talking on the phone. I told you to get off your console, or whatever it is that I'm telling them. They're going to continue and constructing the story that you're telling them. They're going to continue to construct the story you're about to tell them as well. Simultaneously, we might, on occasion, get a defensive reaction to that. Again, that defensive reaction is going to perpetuate, and we're going to create a narrative and a story that's going to happen again. In turn, we anticipate that we're going to have to nag. And so every time that the situation comes up, uh-oh, here it goes again. I'm going to have to nag her to do it. She's not going to do it. I'm going to anticipate that she's just going to ignore my requests. And then I'm going to anticipate that I'm going to have to nag again and again and again. And then my child or he or she may anticipate that, uh-oh, here goes mom, here goes dad. They're going to nag at me again. That story is what they're going to anticipate. And I'm going to get further away from being able to get the results and the actions that I would hope for and hope that my child or my student or teenager would follow. And so we're creating that story in the poetic principle that we always have to nag, and our teenager is they're going to go along with that story and they're going to expect that story. Rather than a positive outcome, sometimes, again, it's going to result in a negative outcome. And so it's going to consistently result in that negative outcome. When they were younger, sometimes they did those tasks. Oh, go brush your teeth. As they get older, they're going to push back. The less likely we are to get to those outcomes. And so the more we nag, the more conflict we create. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. And so in order to help avoid from getting into that back and forth directive using these principles, let's see what we can do to avoid this conflict. One of a great thing to think of this is a heart at peace. And so consider the following, that we have a choice. When these conflicts arise, when our goals are not in alignment, if we are a heart at war, we see objects, we see others, we see our peers, we see our teenagers as obstacles, vehicles, or even irrelevant. They're not going to listen. I might as well not ask. I'm getting the same thing. They're just sitting there. They're not doing what I've asked. And so those requests become irrelevant, and we get more and more frustrated that they're not following through with the task that we really want them to follow through with. When we come from a heart at peace, when we see others that have hopes, they have cares, and their fears are real as our own, we're able to then be in a better place to follow through with the 5 principles of appreciative inquiry and have an improved and strengthened relationship. And this is really the first step. So if you've ever had a teenager push your limits, you know it can be very easy to enter that place of where I'm in a heart of war. I call that emotional hijack sometimes, and I'm frustrated because I'm not getting the results that I would hope for, and they're not making the right choices, and I'm becoming more and more frustrated with the outcomes. And they love to do that. It's part of them growing up. It's part of the process. And so it's easy to get into the heart of war. You always have a choice, and choosing a heart at peace is the goal. So let's give a strategy for when we enter that heart at war. If you can go to the next slide. Utilizing those principles, we can shift that heart at war. And it's again, this is not going to happen overnight. This is something that takes time and changing and co-constructing that language and creating a different story and asking questions and staying positive and anticipating better outcomes. But in order to shift the heart in those moments of conflict, through this lens of appreciative inquiry, one way through the constructionist principle is just to stop. Take a step back and breathe. 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. It's a simple practice. Remember, the conversation that you're about to have is going to create the reality of what the outcome will be. If you're coming from a heart at war and you're highly emotional, or you're upset, or you're frustrated, that will become the reality with both of you. If your child or your teenager is at a heart of war, you will also have difficulty getting the outcome that you're wanting from your student or from your teenager. And so step back and breathe. Allow yourself to see if you can get to a heart at peace. There are times that you may not. Your teenager may not be at that heart of peace. Maybe the conversation can wait. If you're both not at a heart of peace and you're not able to have that conversation, sometimes 5 seconds isn't enough. You may want to step back and take more time. But the first step is realizing that the story you're about to create, the conversation you're about to have, is going to become the reality of what the outcome will be in terms of getting to that correct action. And so in looking at this shifting of the heart through the poetic principle, the stories that we focus on are the stories that we create. So in that moment, as you're having that conversation and you're shifting your heart so you can have a more productive conversation, recall times and situations or experiences when your heart was at peace. When was the time you had a conversation that worked? When did it result in a better outcome for you and for your teenager? And the better you get and the more you practice this and changing that story, the more likely you will have the outcomes that you're hoping for. Think about, what do you want to create? What story is it that you want at the end of this? And how can you change that narrative so that you're not nagging and having that back and forth conversation? So as you step back, think about the story. What story are you creating? And then remember the positive principle. You're looking to generate positive emotions from both yourself and for your team. Come from that groundedness of, I'm going to stay positive. I'm going to find that heart of peace. I know my child wants to do what's right. I know right now we're at a place where my teenager is pushing back. I'm getting frustrated. But I'm going to remain positive. I'm going to practice staying positive and getting to that positive space that we can get closer to an outcome. And lastly, anticipate to have the courage that you're going to follow through on the correct action and you're going to generate that positive outcome. And where this one comes in play is sometimes we have to enforce a consequence that we know is going to frustrate our teenager, or we had set these consequences together, we've come up with an agreement. If we have created and come to a place, shifted our heart to a heart of peace, we are much more likely to generate a positive outcome, even though our student or our child, our teenager, may be frustrated. Have the courage to follow through, as long as you're at a heart of peace, to generate that positive outcome. Because once you do that, if you're continuously nagging and telling your student what to do, or your child or your teenager what to do, you're going to get the same results. Once you enforce a consequence, they'll remember that you enforced the consequence and you came from a place, it was an agreement that you had. They're more likely to do it the next time. And you're going to see an example of this in a minute, if you come from a place at war and you say, oh, I nagged, you didn't do it, you're going to end up getting to that space again. And so again, we're working anticipating that the outcome of me enforcing this is going to change the outcome in the future, because we have an agreement and we can anticipate they'll do the right thing the next time. It's okay to remain a heart of peace. This will eventually change the outcome, even when your teenager may not like the consequence at the time. So I'm going to look at a 3-step process of AI now in the next slide that will also assist in another way to kind of see this in a model. So in order to find a piece at heart, I was speaking with Dr. Stevens recently, and we were emphasizing that this is a journey, not a destination. This doesn't happen overnight. We're not going to enact this process. It's not a one-step process. It's not sequential. It's actually a whole set of principles that we start to practice and we utilize time and time again before we start to see results. So finding a heart at peace is a journey, not a destination. And so here's a small process that can also assist with you getting to that space. And one, it's the appreciating, imagining, acting process. And thinking about these in the moment, do I feel appreciative or good about myself, this situation, or the teenager during that moment of conflict? Am I able to do that? Or am I just seeing them for the teenagers that's making me angry and making me frustrated at that moment? How can I shift to see more of the good or more of what I want? And it can also be done in other situations, not just in those situations with my teenager. Both with myself, how can I help my teenager think this way? Hey, what is it that I can appreciate that what is making me feel good at the time? What is it that they did right? How can I recognize that as opposed to focusing on what they're doing wrong? The next step is getting clear on what it is that you want. Is my attention focused on the outcome that I desire? Is the attention of your teenager focused on the outcome of what they desire? If I'm not feeling or they're not feeling good, and we're not imagining what it is we want out of this outcome, getting to a resolution that you desire can be very difficult and be challenging. And then lastly, if you can have those two in place, once you begin to make an action and once you create that story, it will start to align with what you need and what the consequences are. And remember, these are small actions and they'll get you closer to the ideal action that you want from your teenager. And so those small actions will create the story that you desire. Most importantly, just remember, this is not a destination, it is a journey. And practicing these principles, which we're going to do in a few minutes, are going to help you get closer to that. So finding a heart at peace, and that 3 models one way, those 5 principles through the funnels another. We're going to go back and kind of look at this now at the foundation pyramid that we discussed earlier. So switch to the next slide, thank you. So once you've gotten yourself at a heart of peace and you're able to do that, you're able to step back and take those seconds, you've created those agreements, you have expectations and those are mutual and you work through those. It's important to know with your teenager that it does not get to the correct action immediately. It does not go right from obtaining a heart of peace to suddenly we're now at the correct action of our teenagers. And we all know this is not how it happens. So in the next slide is the pyramid. And I'm going to show you this as our last kind of slide before we move into a video of an actual situation. So if you can go to that next slide, perfect. So once we're able to get out of the box and we step into that place and we build that trust and we obtain a heart of peace, in order to strengthen those relationships with our teens, we have to develop a strong foundation, healthy relationship. And that becomes harder as students start to push and our goals start to spread further apart. So it begins with that trust. Continue working at obtaining that heart of peace for yourself. Help your teenager obtain that heart of peace. How can they step back? Those practices can be there. How can they appreciate the good in themselves and that it's okay to make mistakes? Once that's done, continue building the relationship. Relationships with your teenagers are at the foundation of a successful call to a correct action. They're the foundation of a healthy relationship. And empathy and trust and listening and understanding are crucial in order for you to have a relationship with your students. So when you get into those moments of conflict, you'll be able to help them get to the correct action or even make those correct actions when they're working independently. Some things to help build that relationship are specific praise, praising the good things, the specific act they do, when they make a good decision, when they're making the right decisions. That's going to build a stronger, more positive relationship. Also, consider their relationships with others who have influence. As you know, when they become teenagers, I used to say, middle school and high school, mom and dad aren't their pieces of advice. Sometimes it's a teacher, it's a mentor, it's their peers. Who are those that are having influence? Have relationships with them, showing that you have interest in their peers and interest in others helps you build a stronger relationship with them. It helps you create a dynamic. You'll know who has influence on them and help better understand where they're coming from when they make decisions. It's just a way to create a stronger, healthier relationship and foundation. And then listen and learn. Sometimes the best way to build a relationship and to create a foundation with your teenager is just to listen, show empathy, make sure it's genuine, find out where they're coming from. As I was saying before, they have goals of gaining independence. Hearing them and knowing their goals and knowing why they're doing the actions, that's going to support that stronger foundation relationship so you can stay away from those places or resolve those places of conflict when they arise. And lastly, at that point, when you need to teach and when you are communicating, they're going to be more likely to listen and more likely to learn, which will then again result in a correct action. And so I'd like us to switch to the next slide. And so to capture some of these principles before we give a few examples, a lot of this is similar to Love and Logic. And those of you that aren't familiar, Love and Logic is a great resource that I suggest you explore if you have not already. Perfect. If we could go to the next slide. And so as you saw in the video, we looked first at empathy, understanding, and then natural logical consequences. And when you think about that, we're coming back now to the funnel and utilizing these principles and how they can change the family dynamic. And specifically, I know there have been a few questions, and in the interest of time, so when conflicts arise, is how we can put these practices to work. I know that there's been a question on working with neurodivergent learners and teenagers. And so I'm going to call on Laurie and looking at those principles through a funnel of the neurodivergent teenager in a situation where your teenager may not want to stop playing video games. So some of you may have faced that. And so if Laurie, you could hop on, and I'll start with that just in the interest of time, and then we'll see if we have any other questions to address. But that question came up quite a bit. And so I'll have her look through these situations through those lenses and principles.
Thanks, Shayne. I think I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and just remind everybody that the idea and the real takeaway here is the power of positivity, right? And part of positivity when we're looking at neurodivergence is being neurodivergent affirming and in truly understanding where your child's where the conflict is coming from. So oftentimes, if you have an autistic teen or an autistic child, that conflict might be coming from a different place. So we know that for a lot of autistic people, they experience what's called pathological demand avoidance. I hate that phrase. I will just say that. I would much prefer that it was called like demand overwhelmingness or something like that, which is simply the idea that as a parent, when you understand where your child is coming from and you accept that this is who they are and how they react. So with PDA, pathological demand avoidance, oftentimes anything that the child views as a demand, even if you didn't mean it as a demand, is viewed in what Shayne was talking about, that do this, do it now, do it right now. And that might not even be your intention, but that's how the child hears it. It's viewed as this real affront to their autonomy. So If they're there playing video games and you have established the rule is before you sit down and play video games, you need to feed the dog and you need to empty the dishwasher, and you come home and the dog isn't fed and the dishwasher isn't emptied and your child is playing video games, oftentimes your first reaction, right, is going to be to come in and say, I told you to feed the dog, da, 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 da. And so in using this model, you're going to stop yourself and you're maybe going to remind yourself, you know what? This sometimes is really hard for my child with executive functioning issues to know how to organize. Perhaps we need to take a step back and figure out, well, what order is it going to make the most sense for you to do these chores? What is the end time? So oftentimes I work with families in reducing a lot of conflict with their teens by being able to say, hey, look, here's what we would like you to get done. I try to avoid the word need. It's because that also then becomes so much of a demand, and it sets off that sort of overwhelmingness and reduces the sense of autonomy that we want our teens to be able to develop. So you might say, look, I know you want to get into bed by 11 o'clock. So here are all the things that you need to get done. You need to finish your homework. You need to feed the dog, or I'd like you to feed the dog, and whatever else. And then the logic comes in being able to say, if you spend 4 hours playing video games, you probably won't get to the other chores. So what would work best for you? Do you want to do all the chores first and then you can get on the video games? Do you want to play your video games for 3 hours? And I know that sounds like a lot, but remember, everything is in successive approximations, right? Shayne said it doesn't happen overnight. So yeah, your child who won't get off video games, especially if they're neurodivergent, we might just want to cut 15 minutes off. And we're going to be negotiating with them as we're doing it. We're going to be talking and setting what is going to work for you, and understanding that some of the conflict that develops is because the child is feeling like what you just said was a demand, and you're not giving them the opportunity to kind of be involved in the decisions. And using these principles, when we allow our neurodivergent teen to feel like they are involved. So I have worked with parents also in being able to say, what consequence do you think would work for you if you don't get blank and blank done? And oftentimes when the child themselves or the teen feels like, hey, I came up with my own consequences, then they're more likely to buy into it. It's a much more harmonious relationship. And that's really what you're looking for, is where you're not getting into power struggles and there's not that huge power dynamic. But it's really like, let's come together, right? We're all little pieces in this funnel. We are a system and everything needs to work for all of us. So how can we make that happen? So in the interest of time, I will stop there, so that if there are any other questions, we can get to those. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Horan.
Yeah, feel free to put any questions that you may have in the chat. As we are looking through this, if you have any questions or in terms of some other examples or other ways, I will mention, as I had said earlier, and this came up in the chat, that if you think about that love and logic situation, and someone's response in the chat was mentioning that that wouldn't work in their family dynamic, or in a family dynamic that they could see. And again, remember, the heart of this is, as Laurie was saying, Dr. Stevens, those norms and agreements that you create and those consequences that you work together towards, they're going to help reach the desired outcomes for you and for your family, and it has to work within yours. And as the gentleman was speaking on love and logic, that I would assume that was an agreement that they made, that they would have a consequence, and that would be the consequence. And that's not how I would play that out with my student or with my child. But in my family, if I'm setting those expectations and I'm anticipating, I'm constructing the story that's going to work, and we're doing that together, I'm going to be more likely. If I nag my student, or if I nag my teenager to continue doing that, or I tell them do it, one of the things that say, if I do it now, of course I would not say I would do it now. I would come back to, again, what's a reasonable time frame for us to finish, And to complete this, that's going to be reasonable for the two of us. And so I think sometimes when you're using these principles, it does take time to stop, make those agreements, go back to those basic assumptions, and really think, how do these play out? Because the minute I say, take it out now or else, what is or else? I don't know if anyone's ever said that, what is or else? And then if we don't have an or else, the teenager doesn't know what that means. And every time that we say that, we're not going to have a consequence that's going to help them respond in a way that's going to be constructive for both of us. Did another question come through?
Yeah, so somebody mentioned that they still think that this might be difficult to implement with an autistic ADHD. I think it was two children. And again, I think the idea here is to really focus on, so what are those moments of calm and positivity? What leads to the best reaction, let's say, from your autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent, neurotypical, it doesn't matter. What are those parameters, and are there ways to make that happen more often? So like, if you know, it does really help if I give my child a much longer lead time than I'm initially comfortable with. I want them to do something the minute I tell them. But I also know that if my child has ADHD, they're on their way to go feed the dog. But oh my goodness, there was a fly or my shoe was untied. And then that led me to think about something else. And next thing you know, your child's happily doing something else and the dog was never fed. And but when you are affirming of neurodivergence, you're understanding, okay, wait a minute, this wasn't just a manipulation. It wasn't I'm trying to not comply. It was this is how I function. And then you want to work with your child on, okay, you got distracted on the way. And you're going to say it very positively. And then it's like, how can we together work on what is going to work for you? Do you need me to write it down? Do you want me to not tell you until you're closer to the dog food? You're trying to find out from your child what is going to work from them for them, but still have them. Everybody has to have some level of responsibility and some level of following expectations. But how is that going to work best within your family? And there's not one answer, right? Everybody's going to have a different way because everybody has a different family belief system. So I hope that gets at your question. We could talk about this kind of for hours, but in the interest of time, again, I'll stop there and check the chat and see if there's any other questions there, Shayne, that you want to.
Yeah, no, the only thing I'll add, because I am seeing some fantastic questions, which they actually excite me, and I want to remind everyone, this is a set of principles, and there are specific actions, and some of them that are near and dear to me, both working in education with students who are ADHD or students, someone mentioned a teen with autism. There are specific practices that can be implemented utilizing these principles. But remember, these are principles that are in theory overarching principles, and they're used in correlation with other specific methods. And I know you've talked about DBT and other different models that exist. And I think that this is an open opportunity for another talk on, specifically working with students in those areas, because I saw the same questions come up, and then really giving tangible specific practices, because I thought of ideas already, the use of a timer, and making an agreement with the child that we're going to set a timer that might help us work through that problem. And I've done this in schools and education, and when the timer's up, here's how much we're going to get done, and we work together to set the goals, and they have that timer to watch. Those are specific strategies. Again, these are principles that are helping us focus on the positive rather than them not completing the task or anticipating that they won't. But they're not, again, the answer or the finality of it. They're actually principles that we want to practice and think about. But I love that we could delve deeper into this and provide more information. And I also will put together with Laurie some more resources that apply these in specific situations that we can get to everybody. But I know we're running low on time, and so one more thing from Laurie, and then we can go ahead and wrap with a couple more slides.
Yeah, we're just going to finish up. Let me just address very briefly the last two questions. So, of course, when we're dealing with children who have other types of mental health issues, a lot of things are going to be variable in terms of how much can we ask, how much can we approach. But again, what I want you to take away is if you're aware of that and if you understand that sometimes maybe the expectations that you have just aren't going to be able to happen because your child is feeling exceedingly depressed or something. When you reduce that expectation, then, and you're able to say, you know what, I can tell today's not going to be a day that they're going to feed the dog, then again, you're having a more positive relationship without constantly saying, well, it doesn't matter if you're depressed, go feed the dog. You're listening to what your child is saying and what your child needs in that moment, which might just be comfort and might not be, oh, and remember to feed the dog. So we all are becoming a little bit more flexible. In terms of an extinction burst, this isn't 100% of behavioral principles. So it really depends on what exactly you're applying that to. And also, if we use those successive approximations that I was talking about, we see way less of an extinction burst. So an extinction burst is when behavior gets worse at first, when a child used to get kind of what they wanted or positive reinforcement out of something, and then we take that reinforcement away, their behavior tends to increase because it's like, oh, but I need to get what I used to get. And because this is the idea is that we're listening to what the kids need. This is not a demanding, this is not a compliance idea. We're less likely to see a compliance burst, an extinction burst, sorry. But we're going to end there. All of your questions are being recorded, and we will get back to you on the questions that we were not able to address. But although if you can just move ahead a bit, I just want to again thank Dr. Horan for joining us today and sharing his expertise this morning. I do certainly, if you feel like your children, yourself, or your young adults are struggling with any type of mental health issues, I do want to let you know about our Lumina Counseling Center. We are a private pay and insurance-based program, and the contact number is there if you're seeking out any type of therapy. And I also want to let you know about a couple upcoming events that we have here. So we do have Music for Autism event that's happening on March 17th at our Sherman Oaks campus. And this is an autism-friendly interactive concert for young people with autism and their families. And then also you can join us at the Brad Buckman Photography Studios in Burbank, California, where our annual art show will be spotlighting 3 captivating exhibitions that were done by help group students. And finally, on April 28th, we have our special needs resource fair at our Sherman Oaks campus. And this is an opportunity for parents and professionals to discover the wonderful resources that Los Angeles has to offer for the special needs community. And just one last plug, last but not least, we are now accepting applications for our camps that are available for neurodivergent children and young adults. And I really thank you for attending. I know we went overtime, so I appreciate everybody sticking by. Our next webcast will be April 10th, and we will let you know the topic soon. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and enjoy your day.